All right, so buckle up because we are diving deep into the upcoming German federal election.
Ooh, this is a big one,
Yeah, it is.
especially with the government collapsing back in November.
Yeah, that was a shock to everyone, I think.
Absolutely. It really threw a wrench into things.
It did, it did.
And now this snap election is happening on February 23, 2025.
That's right, February 23rd, coming up fast.
So much to unpack.
Yeah, and you've given us a ton of great background material to help us make sense of it all.
Well, hopefully we can shed some light on it all for you.
I think so. I think so. It's fascinating stuff.
It really is. This snap election has just thrown everyone off balance. You see these established parties just scrambling to figure out how to position themselves.
Right.
The voters are uncertain.
Yeah.
It's a really, really interesting time in German politics.
It feels like Germany's at a crossroads, kind of a turning point.
Absolutely.
So where do we even begin? I guess let's start with the who's who in this race.
Makes sense.
So we've got the CDU-CSU, our kind of traditional center-right party.
Yeah.
Friedrich Merz is at the helm there.
Yes.
They're leading in the polls right now.
They are.
And they're promising, the typical stuff we hear from the center-right, slimming down the bureaucracy, cutting taxes, taking a little bit of a tougher approach on migration and security issues.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You see this kind of rhetoric really tapping into some global anxieties around migration.
Oh, for sure.
Globalization, these kinds of things. It's
Yeah.
not just a German thing, right?
No.
Now, if we look back historically, this is the kind of rhetoric that has fueled populist movements across Europe and even in the United States.
Yeah, we've seen it play out again and again in different contexts.
It's a recurring pattern.
Yeah, and it's not just about individual policies. It's about understanding these bigger trends and how they shape things, right?
Absolutely, the bigger picture.
Okay, so moving on, we have the SPD, center-left. Chancellor Olaf Scholz is trying to hold on to power there.
Yeah.
They're really pushing for a stronger welfare state, renewable energy, social justice, all those things. But their numbers in the polls, they're not looking so good.
Not so good. No, they're trailing on the CDU-CSU.
Yeah.
It's a tough battle for them, So you've got to
is.
squeeze from both sides.
Right.
And to win this, they really need to convince voters that they have a clear vision for the future.
Yeah, a compelling narrative.
Exactly.
Okay, then there's the AfD.
The AfD.
The far-right party that's been steadily gaining ground, known for their kind of controversial views on immigration,
Yeah.
the EU, all the sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, the AfD's rise is significant, right? They're really successfully tapping into anxieties about things like globalization, immigration, particularly among those who feel like they've been left behind
Right.
by economic changes, or who are worried about a loss of traditional values. It's a trend, again, we've seen in other European countries where you have that economic uncertainty
Yeah.
and social change that really fuels this support for populist parties.
Yeah, it's a pattern.
It is.
Okay, on the other end of the spectrum, we've got the Greens
Right.
pushing for, those environmental issues, social justice, strong EU. Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck are leading the charge there.
Yeah.
They were doing really well in the polls, but they've seen a bit of a dip recently.
Yeah, they have. It's a classic dilemma, isn't it, for environmental parties?
I guess so, yeah.
A lot of Germans, they agree with their goals in principle, but some of their climate policies, like, for example, phasing out coal-fired power plants by 2030,
Yeah, that's ambitious.
it's ambitious, and for some people, it seems a little bit too radical, or they worry about the economic impact.
Right.
So they're also dealing with some internal disagreements about how to balance this environmental protection with economic growth and social justice.
It's a tough needle to thread.
It is.
Okay, let's talk about the FDP.
Okay.
The business-friendly liberal party.
Right.
They're fighting to stay relevant in this election.
Yeah.
All about digitalization, cutting red tape, fiscal responsibility. Christian Lindner is leading them.
Yeah, they're barely hanging on in the polls.
They are.
I mean, they're really in danger of not even getting into parliament.
Wow.
It really highlights how fragmented the political landscape has become.
Yeah.
They're competing with other pro-business parties.
Right.
And their traditional focus on this economic liberalism, it's not really resonating as strongly anymore.
Yeah.
With voters who are increasingly concerned about things like social inequality and climate change.
It's a changing landscape.
It is.
Okay, we also have the left, more of a traditional left-wing party, Janine Whistler at the lead.
Yes.
They're also in a fight for survival, trying to connect with voters who feel like maybe the traditional left-wing parties have abandoned them.
Right. Yeah, they're in a tricky spot, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're kind of caught between the SPD and the Greens on one side
Yeah.
and this new Saar-Wagenknecht alliance on the other.
Right.
So they're emphasizing their commitment to really radical social change and their opposition to militarism.
Yeah.
They've been really vocal, for example, in their criticism of Germany's increased military spending
In response to the war?
in response to the Ukraine war.
Yeah. Okay. And speaking of Saar-Wagenknecht,
Right.
her new alliance, the BSW, is making waves.
It is.
This unusual mix of left-leaning economic policies
Yeah.
and kind of right-leaning social stances.
Interesting combination.
It's a combo that could really shake things up.
It could. It really could. The BSW is the wild card in this election.
Yeah.
Wagenknecht, she's a very charismatic figure.
She is.
She's criticized both the left and the right.
Right.
And her alliance might attract voters who are just disillusioned with the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for example, they support a significant increase in the minimum wage,
Okay.
which is popular with a lot of working class voters.
Sure.
But they also take a more restrictive stance on immigration,
Right.
which appeals to some conservative voters.
Yeah.
So this mix of policies makes them a potential coalition partner for a variety of parties.
Yeah, depending on how the numbers shake out.
Exactly.
All right, so we've met the players.
We have.
What stands out to you about this election compared to past ones?
Well, one thing that really strikes me is this rise of populism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's on both the left and the right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You have the AfD and the BSW,
Yeah.
despite their very different ideologies.
Yeah.
They both capitalize on this sense of frustration and alienation among voters who feel ignored by the establishment.
Mhm. The elites, the system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is a broader trend we've seen across Europe, even globally.
Yeah, it's that anti-establishment sentiment.
Yeah, there's a growing distrust of traditional institutions
Mm-hmm.
and a search for these alternative political voices.
People want something new, something different.
They do. They're yearning for change.
Yeah. And I think we see that reflected in the issues that are at the heart of this campaign.
Absolutely.
So let's dive into those.
Okay.
Starting with, I guess, the economy and taxes. Always a big one.
Always a bigger battleground in German elections.
For sure.
And this time is no different.
Yeah.
You know, you've got the CDU, CSU, they're advocating for tax cuts, especially for corporations,
Mhm.
claiming this will boost economic growth.
Right. Trickle-down economics.
Yeah, they've proposed reducing the corporate tax rate to 25%
Wow.
and cutting red tape for businesses.
It's a familiar playbook.
It is. It is.
So what are the potential, I guess, risks and benefits of a strategy like that?
Well, on the one hand, their approach is based on the idea that these tax cuts for corporations will stimulate investment,
Right.
create jobs, ultimately benefiting everyone.
Right.
But the risk, of course, is that these benefits, they might not actually trickle down to everyone.
Yeah.
And it could actually exacerbate income
It's
inequality.
the gamble.
It is.
So what are the other parties saying?
Well, the SPD, for example, they're pushing for increased public investment
Okay.
in areas like infrastructure, education, social programs.
Mm-hmm.
They argue that this is a more effective way to boost the economy
Okay.
and create jobs, especially over the long term.
Right. A more sustainable approach.
Exactly.
And then you have the FDP sticking to their message of fiscal responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
opposing any new tax hikes.
Right. That could be a potential stalemate if they end up as part of a coalition.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Then you have the Greens. They're proposing a wealth tax
Okay.
on high earners to fund their ambitious social and environmental programs.
Right.
They argue that this is necessary to address inequality and ensure a fair and sustainable economy.
Mm-hmm.
They point to studies showing that Germany's wealth gap has been widening in recent years.
Right.
And they say a wealth tax is a fair way to redistribute some of that wealth
Mm-hmm.
and invest in those essential public services.
Okay. And the AfD wants to abolish the CO2 tax.
Yes, they claim it harms businesses and consumers
Mm-hmm.
without effectively addressing climate change.
Right.
And finally, you have the left, who are calling for a more drastic redistribution of wealth.
Okay. More radical.
More radical, yeah.
All right. So a lot of different ideas on the table when it comes to the economy.
There are a lot of disagreement about how to manage things.
Yeah. Big time. Okay. Well, what about migration and security? Always a hot button issue in Germany.
Absolutely. It's another area where the parties have very different approaches.
Okay, lay it out for us.
The CDUC, SU, and the AFD, they're taking a hard line.
Mm-hmm.
They want stricter border controls, tougher
Mm-hmm.
deportation rules,
Okay.
reduction in the number of refugees admitted to Germany.
Right.
They often cite concerns about security,
Mm-hmm.
the strain on social services,
Okay.
and they appeal to voters who feel that immigration is a threat to German identity and culture.
Yeah, we see that rhetoric a lot, playing on those fears.
Unfortunately, it's a common tactic.
Okay, what are the other parties saying?
Well, the Greens and the SPD, they're pushing for a more humanitarian approach.
Okay.
They're emphasizing integration and support for refugees.
Hmm.
They argue that Germany has a moral obligation to help those fleeing war and persecution.
Right.
And they believe that integration is vital for ensuring social cohesion.
Mm-hmm.
They're also calling for reforms to the asylum system to make it more efficient and humane.
Okay.
Highlighting the fact that, Germany has successfully integrated large numbers of immigrants in the past.
Right, they have a track record.
They do.
So it's kind of a contrast between those who prioritize national security and those who stress human rights and compassion.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, and where do the left and the BSW fall on this spectrum?
They have a more nuanced position, kind of combining elements of both. They support social security measures, but also advocate for stricter rules regarding immigration.
Right, so kind of threading the needle there.
They argue for a system that controls immigration while ensuring the humane treatment of refugees.
Okay, balancing act.
Yeah,
It's fascinating how these issues are all interconnected.
they are.
You can't talk about the economy without talking about migration, vice versa.
Exactly, inextricably linked.
And that applies to climate and energy policy too, right?
Absolutely.
So let's shift gear to that.
Okay.
Germany, of course, a leader in renewable energy, but still a lot of debate about how to transition away from fossil fuels and nuclear power.
A lot of debate, yeah.
What are we hearing from the parties on this?
Well, the Greens and the SPD, they're advocating for a rapid transition to 100% renewable energy by 2040.
Ambitious.
Very ambitious. They want to span new combustion engine cars by 2030.
Okay.
Invest heavily in public transportation, energy efficiency, green technologies.
Right.
They often point to the success of Germany's Energiewende, which is their plan to transition to a low-carbon economy, as evidence that such a transformation is possible.
Okay, so big goals there.
Big goals.
What about the other parties? Are they on board with that?
Well, the CDU and the AFD, while acknowledging the need to address climate change, they're less enthusiastic about this rapid shift to renewables.
Okay.
They claim it'd be too costly, too disruptive to the economy.
Yeah.
They express concerns about the reliability of renewable energy sources
Okay.
and the potential impact on jobs in the traditional energy sectors.
So more cautious, wanting to maybe maintain the status quo a bit longer.
To some extent, yes, and the CDU is even open to reintroducing nuclear energy as a bridge technology.
Interesting.
They believe it's a reliable and low-carbon energy source.
Okay, so bringing nuclear back into the mix.
Potentially, yeah.
And the AFD, what are they saying?
Well, the AFD, they actually reject the scientific consensus on climate change
Okay.
and oppose measures that could harm the German economy.
Right.
They often downplay the risks of climate change
Mm-hmm.
and promote the continued use of fossil fuels.
So quite a different perspective there.
Very different.
Okay, and the left, where do they stand?
The left, they support a state-led approach to energy policy.
Right.
They argue that the private sector can't be trusted to make the necessary investments in renewable energy, so they want to nationalize the energy industry
Wow.
and quickly transition to 100% renewable energy.
Okay.
They point to examples of successful public ownership of energy companies in other countries,
Okay.
arguing that it can lead to lower energy prices and a faster transition to renewables.
So again, a very distinct point of view.
Very distinct.
All right, so we've got this range from, the Greens' ambitious goals to the AFD's skepticism about climate change.
Yeah, a lot of different viewpoints.
This is going to be a fiercely debated topic
Oh, absolutely.
in the weeks leading up to the election.
Without a doubt.
Okay, and speaking of topics that spark debate, let's move on to foreign policy.
Okay.
And, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Yes, a defining issue for many voters.
It is.
And the parties are divided on how to respond to Russia's aggression.
So what are the different stances we're seeing?
Well, the CDU, the Greens, the SPD, and the FDP, they all agree on supporting Ukraine with military aid
Okay.
and maintaining sanctions against Russia.
All right, so on that issue, pretty unified.
For the most part, yes.
Okay.
But, of course, there are nuances.
There always are.
The Greens, for example, they're a bit more cautious about providing heavy weaponry to Ukraine,
Okay.
fearing that it could escalate the conflict.
Right.
They emphasize the importance of diplomacy and dialogue alongside military support,
Okay.
arguing that a negotiated solution is the only way to achieve lasting peace.
All right, so a more diplomatic approach there.
Yeah.
Okay, and the AfD, the BSW, and the left, they've been known to be a bit more sympathetic to Russia's position.
They have.
What are they saying?
They oppose sending arms to Ukraine, and they call for a negotiated settlement. They argue that NATO expansion is partly responsible for the current situation,
Okay.
and that dialogue with Russia is essential for peace.
Right.
They also express skepticism about the effectiveness of sanctions and argue that they harm ordinary Russians more than the Russian government.
So kind of a different perspective on the conflict.
Yeah, a different lens.
It seems like this election is shaping up to be a battle between two distinct visions for Germany's future.
It does, yeah.
One embracing internationalism, a strong role for Germany in the world, and another that's more inward-looking,
Right.
skeptical of global engagement.
It's a fundamental tension.
It is, and it's woven through all these major issues.
Absolutely.
From the economy to migration to foreign policy.
It's the underlying thread.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground here, met the players, explored the key issues.
A lot to digest.
Yeah, what are your initial thoughts?
Well, one thing that's clear is that this election is incredibly significant for Germany.
Yeah.
It has huge implications both domestically and internationally.
For sure.
The choices made by German voters will shape the country's direction for years to come.
Absolutely.
But as you mentioned earlier, it's unlikely that any single party will secure a majority.
Right.
Coalitions are pretty much inevitable.
Yeah, it's how the system works.
It is, which adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Oh, yeah, it's a political puzzle.
It is, and the pieces are still moving.
So let's try to piece together this puzzle.
All right, game on.
What are the most likely coalition scenarios, and what are the potential strengths and weaknesses of each?
Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Predicting the outcome of this election, it really hinges on understanding which parties can kind of find common ground and form a governing majority.
Yeah, it's all about building alliances, right?
It is. It's like a political puzzle.
It is. It is.
And it depends not just on numbers, but on personalities.
Right.
The art of compromise.
Yeah, so let's try to piece together this puzzle. What are the most likely scenarios based on what we see in the polls?
Right.
And, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each potential coalition?
So the most probable outcome, and this is based on the current polling data, is a grand coalition between the CDU-CSU and the SPD.
Okay, so kind of continuing the pattern.
Yeah, a continuation of what we've seen before in German politics.
Right.
Which would offer, stability, experience.
Yeah.
But it could also be prone to gridlock.
Right, because they're not exactly aligned on everything.
No, not at all, especially given their ideological differences.
Yeah.
The SPD might have to concede on some key issues like social welfare and climate policy to appease the more conservative CDU-CSU.
So it's a trade-off.
It is. It's a trade-off between stability and boldness.
Right, stability and boldness. Okay, what about that Jamaica coalition you mentioned earlier?
Yeah.
CDU, CSU, Greens, and FDP, right?
It's right.
Why is it called that?
It's a nickname based on the colors of the Jamaican flag.
Oh, okay.
Black for the CDU-CSU, green for the Greens, and yellow for the FDP.
I see. All right, very visual.
It is. It's visually striking.
So this combination, could be quite dynamic.
It could.
Blending the CDU-CSU's focus on economic growth with the Greens' commitment to sustainability, and then the FDP's emphasis on digitalization.
It sounded on paper.
It does, but are there hurdles? I mean, come on, there's got to be some challenges there.
Definitely. The Greens and the FDP have very different views on economic policy.
Okay, so that could be a sticking point.
It could, particularly regarding taxes and spending.
Right.
The Greens would likely push for substantial concessions on climate policy from the CDU-CSU.
Yeah, they're not going to budge on that.
No, and that could create some friction within the coalition.
Yeah, tension, for sure. Are there any other possibilities out there besides these two?
Well, there's a slim chance that the current coalition could stay in power.
Okay.
It's known as the Ample Coalition, which means traffic lights.
Oh, right, because of their color.
Exactly. Red for the SPD, green for the Greens, and yellow for the FDP. But given the FDP's current struggles,
Yeah, they're barely hanging on.
They are.
So probably not going to happen.
Probably not.
Okay, what about, a coalition that leans more to the left, like the Red-Red-Green coalition?
The red-red-green.
SPD Greens the left?
It's mathematically possible,
Okay.
but highly improbable.
Why is that?
Well, The SPD has consistently ruled out working with the left
Okay.
because of their strong stances on issues like foreign policy and NATO.
Yeah, makes sense.
For instance, the left has advocated for Germany's withdrawal from NATO.
That's a non-starter for a lot of people.
It is. It's a red line for the SPD.
So, not going to happen.
And even if they were open to it, it's uncertain whether they would even secure enough seats to form a majority.
Okay, so that one's off the table. What about a Germany coalition?
The Germany coalition, so that would consist of the CDU-CSU, the SPD, and the FDP. It's seen as a potential backup plan. If the CDU-CSU and the FPD can't agree on a program for a grand coalition,
Right.
so it might offer a more centrist approach.
Yeah.
But again, the ideological gaps between the parties could hinder their ability to form a stable and effective government.
So a lot of potential for, I guess, tension there, too.
There is.
Okay, so we've talked about, Grand Coalition, Jamaica, ample, red, red, green, Germany. There's one combination we haven't talked about. What about the CDU-CSU and the AfD?
That scenario, sometimes referred to as the black-blue coalition, is highly unlikely.
Okay.
Almost impossible.
What makes it so impossible?
Well, the CDU-CSU has firmly rejected any kind of partnership with the AfD.
Okay.
They cite the AfD's far-right ideology, extremist views. They just don't see it as a viable option.
So that one's a non-starter.
It is. It would be a huge political gamble for the CDU-CSU.
Yeah, could backfire big time.
It could.
Okay, so black-blue off the table. What about the BSW? Could they be a potential partner for someone?
It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah, they're the wild card.
They're a new force, unpredictable. Their potential partners would depend on the final results.
Yeah, how the cookie crumbles.
And the political landscape that emerges after the election.
Okay, so they could align with, the CDU-CSU or the FPD.
They could. It's really a guessing game at this point.
They hold a lot of power, potentially.
They do. They do.
Okay, so we've explored these different coalition scenarios.
We have.
But of course, this is all speculation.
It is. We're just playing with possibilities.
Right. The real question is, which of these coalitions would actually be the most stable and effective in governing Germany?
That's the million-dollar question.
And what are the obstacles they might face in even forming a government?
That's another key point.
So what are the factors that we should be watching for in these coming weeks?
Well, one critical factor is going to be the relative strength of each party after the votes are counted.
So how decisively they win or lose?
Exactly. If the CDU-CSU secures a really significant share of the vote, they might be able to form a government with a smaller partner, like the FDP, maybe even the Greens, without having to make too many compromises.
So they'd be in a strong position.
They would.
But what if, no one really emerges with a clear advantage? What happens then?
Well, in that scenario, we're likely to see extended and complex negotiations.
Oh, yeah, gridlock.
Potentially, yeah. Each party is going to be jockeying for position, trying to gain as much leverage as possible.
Right, trying to get the best deal for themselves.
Exactly. And this could lead to delays in forming a government.
Yeah, which is never good.
No, it creates uncertainty, which can impact the economy.
So instability, potentially?
Yeah, a hung parliament could definitely lead to some political instability.
And Germany's facing a lot of challenges right now.
Oh, absolutely.
Domestically and internationally.
The war in Ukraine, the energy crisis,
right.
Rising inflation,
yeah,
the whole climate change issue.
They're going to have their work cut out for them.
They will, no matter who ends up in charge.
Yeah. Are there other roadblocks they might run into? Besides these kind of, I guess, structural issues?
Yeah, certainly. One potential obstacle is, the personalities involved.
Okay, the human factor.
The human factor, right? Personal relationships and political egos can play a big role in coalition negotiations.
Yeah, because it's not just about numbers.
No, it's about people.
Yeah.
If party leaders clash or they're unwilling to compromise, it could derail the whole process.
Yeah, and we've seen that happen before, right?
We have, a prime example is the relationship between the FDP leader, Christian Lindner, and the Green Party leaders, Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck.
Okay.
They've clashed publicly in the past.
Yeah, that's not a good sign.
Not a good sign. It could make forming a Jamaica coalition very challenging.
Yeah, so it's not just about aligning on policies.
No, it's also about managing those personalities.
Yeah, the political maneuvering.
The behind-the-scenes stuff.
All right, so another potential hurdle, I guess, is public opinion.
Yeah.
Even if the party leaders agree on a coalition, they got to convince their voters.
They do.
That this is the right move.
Because if the public perceives the coalition as weak or ineffective or not representative of their interests, it could undermine the government's legitimacy.
And then they can't really govern effectively.
Exactly. Take the Grand Coalition, for example. It offers stability, but it's often seen as a compromise that doesn't fully satisfy anyone.
Right. No one's really happy.
And that can lead to voter apathy, disengagement.
And that's not good for democracy.
It's not.
So it's a delicate balancing act.
It is.
You got to find common ground on the policies, manage the personal relationships, then you got to sell it to the public.
You do. You got to bring the people along.
Yeah.
This election really highlights the fact that democracy is a dynamic process.
It is.
It can be messy.
Yeah.
It's not always about finding the perfect solution.
Right.
It's about finding a solution that works.
Okay.
Even if it requires compromise.
So messy but necessary.
Exactly.
And even in a, well-established democracy like Germany, there's always that element of unpredictability.
Always.
You never know what's going to happen.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Yeah, it keeps us on our toes.
It does. It does.
All right, so as we head into, the final stretch of this election, what does it all mean for Germany, for Europe, for the world?
Big questions.
Nor.
What are the potential consequences of these different approaches we've been talking about?
Yeah.
These different coalitions, these different scenarios?
What should we be watching for as this political drama unfolds?
It's going to be a wild ride.
I think so. So we've explored the parties, their platforms, the potential alliances, and, the hurdles they'll face in forming a government.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Yeah. What does this all actually mean for Germany?
Yeah, like on the home front and the world stage, what are the stakes here?
Well, the ramifications of this election are huge. Domestically, the outcome could have a really profound impact on Germany's economy, its social cohesion, its role within Europe.
Okay, so let's kind of unpack that a little bit. Starting with the economy, we heard a lot about different economic visions from the parties. The CDU-CSU focused on tax cuts and deregulation.
Yeah.
The SPD on social welfare and public investment.
Right. Two very different approaches.
How might those approaches play out in practice if they're actually implemented?
Well, if the CDU-CSU's approach is implemented, it could lead to some short-term economic growth.
Okay.
But it also carries the risk of widening the gap between the rich and the poor.
Right.
And potentially weakening the social safety net.
Okay, so kind of a trade-off there.
It is.
Short-term gains versus long-term stability.
Exactly. The SPD's approach, on the other hand, might result in a little bit slower growth initially, but it could create a more equitable and sustainable economy over the long term.
Right, so it's that classic dilemma, balancing those immediate gains with long-term sustainability.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of Germany's social fabric. The rise of the AfD and the BSW, it reveals a certain level of dissatisfaction with the status quo.
Right.
Especially among those who feel like they haven't benefited from globalization and these social changes.
Yeah, it's like that feeling that the system's not working for everyone.
Yeah, that feeling of being left behind.
How might that play out, depending on who ends up forming the government?
Well, if the next government fails to address these concerns, it could fuel further social division and political polarization.
Right. So that's a real risk.
It is. But on the flip side, a government that can actually bridge that divide and create a more inclusive society that could strengthen Germany's social cohesion and make it more resilient to these future challenges.
So a lot depends on leadership and their ability to kind of bring people together.
It does. It's about finding that common ground.
Yeah, creating that shared sense of purpose.
Absolutely. And then you have the question of Germany's role in Europe as the largest and most powerful economy in the EU. Germany's political choices have a huge impact on the entire continent.
It's a lot of responsibility.
It is.
So how might this election's outcome affect Germany's relationships with its European partners?
Well, a CDU-CSU-led government might take a more assertive stance in European affairs.
Okay.
They might push for greater fiscal discipline and maybe a more cautious approach to further integration.
Okay.
Whereas an SPD-led government might be more inclined toward compromise and a more ambitious agenda for European integration.
So the election could determine whether Germany is kind of leading the charge or taking a step back.
Yeah, it's about the direction of Europe as a whole.
Wow. And then we have to consider the global picture.
Of course, Germany is a major player on the world stage.
It is.
With interests and responsibilities that span the globe.
For sure. So how might this election influence Germany's foreign policy and its role in international affairs?
Well, one key area to watch is Germany's relationship with Russia.
Mm.
The war in Ukraine has really put a strain on that relationship.
Right.
And the next government will have to figure out how to navigate this complex and very delicate situation.
It's a tough one.
It is.
So what are the options?
Well, a more hawkish government might take a tougher stance on Russia.
Okay.
They might increase military spending and advocate for a more assertive NATO posture.
Right, so kind of a show of strength.
Yeah, drawing a line in the sand.
Okay, and what's the alternative?
A more dovish government. They might prioritize dialogue and diplomacy.
Okay.
Seek ways to de-escalate tensions and find a peaceful resolution.
So two very different paths forward.
They are. It's a tightrope walk.
Yeah, between standing up for democratic values and avoiding further escalation.
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is. What about Germany's relationship with China? That's another big one to consider.
Absolutely. Germany has strong economic ties with China.
Yeah, huge trading partner.
But there are also growing concerns about China's human rights record and their increasingly assertive foreign policy.
Right.
So the next government's going to have to find a way to balance these competing interests.
Yeah, that's not easy.
No, it's about promoting trade and cooperation while also addressing those human rights concerns
Right.
and pushing back against any aggression.
So a lot of difficult choices ahead.
There are, both domestically and internationally.
Yeah. It feels like a real turning point for Germany.
It does. This is a defining moment,
Yeah.
not just for Germany, but for Europe and for the world as a whole.
The decisions made in Berlin are going to have a ripple effect.
They will. They will. The decisions made in the coming months and years will have far-reaching consequences.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this German federal election, what's the key takeaway for you? What should our listeners be paying attention to as this story continues to unfold?
The most important thing to remember is that this election is about more than just who wins and who loses.
Okay.
It's about the kind of future that Germany wants to build for itself and for the world.
Right.
It's about finding that balance between competing priorities, tackling complex challenges, and ultimately creating a society that is both prosperous and just...
Big questions, big choices.
There are.
Well said. And what's the one question you'd want our listeners to consider as they follow this unfolding narrative?
I would encourage everyone to think about how the outcome of this election might affect Germany's relationship with their own country.
That's a great point.
Germany's decisions on issues like trade, climate change, security, these things will have an impact far beyond their borders.
They will.
So it's crucial to understand how those decisions might shape the world we all live in.
Really insightful. Something to think about, for sure.
I hope so.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the German federal election.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be watching closely as this story develops. And we'll be back with more insights and analysis as events warrant.